It was a warm Saturday afternoon when the Martin family gathered for their annual picnic at the lake. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a golden glow on the green grass, while the sound of laughter and clinking glasses filled the air. The perfect setting for a family get-together, except for the dark secret that was about to shatter the peaceful atmosphere. Sophie Martin, the youngest of the three siblings, had always been the life of the party. With her bright smile and quick wit, she could make anyone laugh, and today was no different. She greeted her older sister, Emma, with a hug before looking over at her husband, Daniel, who was chatting with their father. Her heart fluttered. It had been a perfect morning, but little did anyone know that the storm was about to arrive. The picnic was in full swing when Sophie noticed something unusual. Emma and Daniel were standing alone near the edge of the lake, talking quietly. Sophie frowned. It wasn't the first time she had seen them share a private moment, but there was something different this time. An unease settled over her, but she pushed it aside. After all, it could be nothing. Emma was her sister, and Daniel was her husband, they were family. But then, everything changed. Sophie was returning from the snack table when she overheard a snippet of conversation. Emma's voice was low, but the words pierced Sophie's thoughts like a knife. "You promised you'd never tell her," Emma said. Sophie froze, feeling a wave of confusion and dread wash over her. Who was Emma talking to? Her gaze quickly darted to Daniel, who looked visibly uncomfortable. Sophie approached them slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to know what was going on. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, but enough to make them both turn towards her. Emma's eyes widened for a moment, but she quickly masked her surprise. "Nothing, Soph. We were just..." Before she could finish, Sophie interrupted, her voice shaking with emotion. "What do you mean, never tell her? What is it that you've been hiding?" Daniel sighed, his face filled with regret. He opened his mouth to speak, but Sophie wasn't going to let him off that easily. "What aren't you telling me, Daniel?" The silence hung between them like an unbearable weight. Emma looked down at the ground, unable to meet Sophie's gaze, while Daniel looked like he was preparing to confess a truth he had kept hidden for far too long. And then, it came, like a brutal slap to the face. "I've been having an affair," Daniel said quietly, his voice barely audible. Sophie's world tilted. Her breath caught in her throat. "What?" she whispered. The picnic, the laughter, the family, all of it felt like a distant memory now. She felt her knees go weak, and she had to brace herself against the tree beside her. "It's been going on for 15 years, Daniel continued, his voice trembling. "With Emma." Sophie stared at her sister, disbelief flooding her chest. "What are you talking about?" she choked out. "You and Daniel. For 15 years. Emma nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Sophie. We never meant for you to find out like this. We never wanted to hurt you." Sophie's mind raced as the words sunk in. The love of her life, the man she had trusted above all others, had been in love with her sister for over a decade. 15 years of lies. 15 years of betrayal. Her heart felt as though it was being ripped apart, piece by piece. The picnic continued in the background, the sounds of family and laughter still floating in the air, but Sophie could no longer hear them. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. She looked at Daniel and Emma, her vision blurred with tears. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you keep this from me?" Daniel took a step forward, his voice filled with regret. "We thought we were protecting you, Sophie. We didn't want to hurt you." Sophie shook her head in disbelief. "You thought you were protecting me? By lying to me for 15 years?" The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Sophie felt as though her entire life had been a lie. She looked from Daniel to Emma and back again, struggling to find words, but none seemed to do justice to the ache in her chest. "I trusted you both," she finally whispered, her voice cracking with pain. She turned away then, walking away from them both, the sounds of the picnic fading into the background. She couldn't stay there, not with them. She needed to get away, to process everything, but she wasn't sure how she would ever heal from this betrayal. The picnic went on, but Sophie's world had already shattered. And no one, least of all her sister and husband, could ever put the pieces back together. The following days were a blur of confusion and anger. Sophie had fled the picnic, not knowing where she was going or what she was supposed to do. The world outside seemed unchanged, yet everything in her life had been flipped upside down. She didn't call Emma or Daniel. She couldn't. She needed space, time to breathe, but more than that, she needed answers. The house she and Daniel had shared for years felt foreign now. Every room echoed with memories, but now, those memories were tainted. She found herself walking through the rooms, her mind racing, replaying every moment from the past, every smile, every touch, every whispered word. How had she missed it? How had she not seen the signs? She questioned everything. For the first time in years, she couldn't stand the sight of Daniel's things scattered around. His jacket hung on the back of the chair in the living room, his shoes by the door, little reminders of the man who had betrayed her. Sophie felt sick to her stomach just looking at them. She had spent years thinking they were building something real, something lasting, only to find out it had all been a lie. And then there was Emma. Her sister, her best friend, how could she have done this to her? Sophie's heart ached just thinking about the betrayal. For 15 years, Emma had been part of the deception, sharing the man she thought was hers alone. Sophie couldn't understand it. She knew her sister had her flaws, but this? This was something she couldn't fathom. Days turned into weeks, and still, neither Daniel nor Emma reached out. Sophie had expected at least some kind of apology, but nothing came. It was as though they had washed their hands of the whole situation, as if it was easier for them to ignore the damage they had caused than to face the woman they had hurt so deeply. One evening, as Sophie sat alone in the kitchen, nursing a glass of wine, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Emma. Sophie hesitated for a moment, then read the text. "I know I can't fix what I've done, but I need you to know I never wanted to hurt you. Please, we need to talk. I'm sorry." Sophie stared at the message, her fingers trembling around the glass. She felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, but above all, betrayal. She had spent years trusting Emma, looking up to her as the sister who always had her back, and now she was the one who had broken it all. With a deep breath, Sophie typed a reply. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Emma. I don't know if I ever will." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. Then, she put the phone down, drained her glass, and leaned back in her chair. It felt like a small release, but the hurt was still there, gnawing at her. A few days later, Daniel showed up at the door. Sophie hadn't expected him to come. He had always been the type to run from confrontation, especially when things got difficult. But there he was, standing on her doorstep, looking hesitant and lost. "Sophie, please," he said, his voice shaky. "We need to talk." She didn't invite him in. Instead, she crossed her arms and stared at him, waiting for him to speak. "I'm so sorry," Daniel began, his voice thick with regret. "I never wanted to hurt you. I was stupid, selfish." Sophie held up her hand, cutting him off. "No, Daniel. You don't get to do that. You don't get to apologize after everything you've done. 15 years. 15 years of lies and deceit. You don't get to just show up and make it all better." "I never wanted to hurt you," Daniel repeated, but Sophie could hear the desperation in his voice. "But you did," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You both did. And I don't know how to look at you the same way anymore." Daniel's eyes were pleading now, his face drawn with guilt. I know. I don't expect you to forgive me, Sophie. I just need you to understand how much I regret everything." Sophie shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I can't understand it, Daniel. I can't understand why you would do this to me. To us. He reached for her, but Sophie stepped back, her heart racing. Don't touch me, she said sharply. Daniel flinched, his expression crumbling. I never wanted this, Sophie. I never meant for you to find out like this. I thought I could keep it hidden, but now, you couldn't keep it hidden forever, Sophie said bitterly. And neither could she. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating the space between them. Sophie took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the hurt was still there, cutting through her. Leave, she said quietly. I need you to go. Daniel didn't say anything more. He simply turned and walked away, leaving Sophie standing in the doorway, her heart breaking with every step he took. She closed the door behind him, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to break down. The tears flowed freely, the weight of it all crashing down on her. She had loved him. She had trusted him. And now, all of that was gone. Sophie wasn't sure what her next steps would be. The future was uncertain, the road ahead unclear, but one thing was certain, she couldn't stay in this world of lies. She would have to rebuild, piece by piece, even if it meant letting go of the people she once thought she could never live without. The days that followed Daniel's visit were filled with a kind of numbness Sophie had never experienced before. She kept to herself, distancing herself from the world. Her phone lay untouched on the table, ignored. She couldn't bring herself to talk to anyone, least of all her family. How could she explain the chaos in her mind? How could she tell them that everything she had built her life around was a lie? For the first time in years, Sophie found herself alone in a way she had never been before. She had always been the strong one, the one who could lean on others, but now the support she needed was nowhere to be found. Her trust had been shattered, and with it, any semblance of the life she once knew. Sophie had always believed in family. She believed in the bond between sisters, in the unconditional love between a husband and wife. But those bonds had been broken, irreparably torn by the people who were supposed to protect her heart. One morning, she woke up early, the cold light of dawn creeping through the curtains. She felt tired, though she had hardly slept. The night had been long, filled with restless tossing and turning, thoughts of Daniel and Emma haunting her every move. There was no escaping it. She knew it was time to face the truth, even if it was the last thing she wanted to do. The pain in her chest was unbearable, but it was the only thing that reminded her she was still alive. She needed closure, a final confrontation that would either break her entirely or help her move on. Sophie stood up, walking over to the window and staring out at the empty street below. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the windowsill as she took a steadying breath. It was time to speak to Emma. The phone call came later that afternoon. Sophie had debated it for hours, but in the end, she knew she couldn't keep avoiding it. Hello. Emma's voice sounded hesitant, as though she wasn't sure what to expect. Sophie felt a pang of sorrow. The woman on the other end of the line sounded so much like her sister, yet so distant now. She didn't feel like the person who had shared countless secrets, dreams, and moments with her. Sophie. Emma began, but Sophie cut her off. I need to talk to you, Sophie said, her voice firm but shaky. In person. Can you meet me? There was a long pause on the other end. Sophie could practically hear Emma's thoughts racing. Finally, Emma's voice, quiet but resigned, came through. I'll be there in an hour. Sophie hung up, the air thick with the weight of what was about to unfold. She sat on the couch, her mind spinning, trying to prepare herself for what would come next. It didn't matter how many times she thought about it, nothing could truly prepare her for the conversation ahead. An hour later, the doorbell rang. Sophie stood up, her heart pounding. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. She opened the door to find Emma standing on the other side, her eyes red from crying, her face pale. "Come in," Sophie said, stepping aside. Emma walked in slowly, her hands folded in front of her, almost as if she were bracing herself for a storm. Sophie led her to the living room and sat down, her eyes never leaving her sister's face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, oppressive. Finally, Sophie broke it. "Why, Emma? Why did you do it?" Emma's eyes filled with tears again, but she didn't look away. She took a deep breath before answering. "I never meant for it to happen like this. It started so long ago, and I didn't know what to do. I was weak. I was selfish." Sophie clenched her fists at her sides, fighting to keep her composure. "You were my sister. You were the one person I should have been able to trust the most." "I know," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. "And I failed you. I never meant to hurt you. I thought I could control it. I thought I could keep it hidden. Hidden. For 15 years, Emma. How could you look me in the eye every day and pretend everything was fine?" Sophie's voice cracked with the pain that had been building up inside her for so long. Emma's face crumpled as the tears spilled over. "I didn't know how to tell you. It wasn't just about the affair, Sophie. It was. I didn't want to lose you. I didn't want you to hate me." Sophie's hands trembled in her lap as the weight of the words settled in. "So you lied. For years. You didn't think about how much it would hurt me when the truth finally came out. I thought it would be easier to keep it from you," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I was wrong. I was so wrong." Sophie's heart was breaking in two. She could see the genuine remorse in Emma's eyes, but it wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough to undo the hurt. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," Sophie said, her voice hoarse. "I don't know how to fix this." Emma nodded, her tears falling freely now. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even deserve it." For a long time, they sat there in silence, the weight of everything that had happened settling over them both. Sophie wanted to scream, to yell at Emma for what she had done, but she couldn't bring herself to. Instead, she sat still, her heart aching for the sister she had once known, but could no longer trust. Eventually, Emma stood up, wiping her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Sophie," she whispered again, her voice cracking with regret. Sophie didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she just nodded, her gaze distant, already feeling the beginning of the distance that would separate them forever. Emma left the house, and once again, Sophie was alone. The quiet settled around her, but it was different this time. Sophie didn't feel the same emptiness she had before. Now, there was a sense of finality to it. The pieces of her world were scattered, but she could see a path forward. It wasn't going to be easy, and it would take time, but she would rebuild. She had to. The days after Emma left felt eerily quiet, but Sophie couldn't escape the suffocating stillness. The house seemed too large now, too empty. Her life had once been filled with noise, family, laughter, the hum of a shared routine. Now, it was all gone. The emptiness gnawed at her, pulling her in every direction, but Sophie couldn't bring herself to leave. She had nowhere to go. Her friends had reached out, but she wasn't ready to face anyone, not yet. Her mind drifted to the future. What was left for her? What could possibly remain after the fabric of everything she had known had been torn apart? She could still feel the weight of Daniel's betrayal, the coldness of Emma's apology. Neither of them had truly understood the magnitude of their actions. Sophie had spent days trying to make sense of it all, but the truth was simple, she couldn't fix it. They had broken something that could never be restored. And so, Sophie focused on the only thing that seemed within her control, herself. It started small. Sophie had always prided herself on being strong, on pushing through difficult situations. Now, she had no choice but to do the same. She spent long hours going through old boxes in the attic, sorting through memories, photographs, old letters, trinkets that had once been so important to her. She found herself holding on to the past, as though she could somehow cling to the version of her life before the betrayal. But there was a point where she had to let it go. One afternoon, Sophie decided to take a walk through the park, her feet crunching along the gravel path. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground. The air was cool, a welcome relief from the humidity of the past few days. As she walked, she couldn't help but notice how people passed by her, couples, families, groups of friends. They all seemed so normal. So happy. Sophie felt a pang of envy but quickly shoved it away. They didn't know what she was going through. They hadn't lost everything in one fell swoop. Her mind wandered back to the conversation with Emma. She could still see the tears in her sister's eyes, could still hear her broken apology. But that didn't change anything. The trust had been shattered. And trust, Sophie knew, was something that was never easily regained. She found herself at the park's small lake, the water still and calm, reflecting the setting sun. Sophie stood at the edge, her hands resting on the railing, her eyes on the horizon. She realized something then, a small but significant shift inside her. She could let this consume her. She could drown in the anger and heartbreak, let it define her for the rest of her life. Or, she could choose a different path. She wasn't sure yet what that would look like, but she knew one thing for certain, she didn't want to spend the rest of her life broken. Sophie didn't go back home right away. Instead, she walked to a nearby cafe, sat at the counter, and ordered a coffee. She let herself sit there in the quiet, staring out the window as life went on around her. She was just a woman, a person in the world, no longer defined by the role of wife or sister. And for the first time since everything fell apart, she didn't feel entirely alone. As the weeks turned into months, Sophie started making small changes. She began seeing a therapist, something she had never thought to do before. She started running again, something that had once brought her peace, even if she had stopped when life became too overwhelming. She worked on her own healing, brick by brick, knowing that the process would be long. But each step was a small victory. And then, one evening, as Sophie was working through a pile of papers on her kitchen table, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel. She hadn't heard from him in weeks. Not since the confrontation. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," the message began. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I wanted to say I'm sorry, Sophie. For everything. I'll always care about you. I hope one day, you'll be able to forgive me." Sophie read the message twice, her heart heavy. It was the kind of apology she had always wished for, but now it felt hollow. She didn't know if she could ever forgive him, and at that moment, she wasn't sure she wanted to. She put the phone down and took a deep breath, focusing on the decision in front of her. This wasn't about them anymore. This wasn't about seeking their approval or validation. It was about her. She had spent too long trying to fix the pieces of a life that had been broken by others. Now, it was time to rebuild her own. Sophie didn't reply to the message. She didn't need to. She already knew the answer. She had come far enough along in her own healing that she didn't need to hold on to the past anymore. The anger, the betrayal, the resentment, it was all starting to fade, slowly but surely. And with each passing day, she felt a little lighter. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of it. It was hers to shape, hers to navigate. And whatever came next, Sophie knew she would face it on her own terms. She was learning to trust herself again, and that was enough. As the sun set outside her window, Sophie smiled, a quiet strength settling in her chest. It wasn't the ending she had imagined, but it was her beginning. And that was enough. Months passed, and Sophie settled into a new rhythm. The silence in her home had become familiar, almost comforting in its own way. The space she had once shared with Daniel felt like a distant memory, and Sophie could no longer recall what it had been like to share her life with him. She had moved on, or at least, she was moving forward. She still spent a lot of time at the park, and the walks had become her sanctuary. The stillness of the lake, the rustling of leaves in the trees, it was a balm to the wounds she had carried for so long. She found herself smiling more often now, small bursts of joy that caught her by surprise. The heaviness was starting to lift, piece by piece. One evening, as Sophie walked through the park, she saw a familiar face. It was Sarah, a friend from college she hadn't seen in years. She had always admired Sarah's ability to be carefree, her ability to live in the moment. Sophie hesitated, unsure whether she was ready to face anyone from her past, but then Sarah waved enthusiastically, a warm smile spreading across her face. "Sophie! I can't believe it's you!" Sarah exclaimed, walking up to her with open arms. "How have you been?" Sophie smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing as Sarah hugged her. It was strange, how easily they fell into conversation. They sat on a bench by the lake, talking about old memories and catching up on life. Sophie found herself laughing again, a genuine laugh, something she hadn't done in a long time. The conversation turned to her life, and Sarah's smile faltered when Sophie hesitated. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," Sarah said gently, sensing the unease in Sophie's voice. But Sophie found herself telling Sarah everything, the affair, the betrayal, the aftermath. She didn't expect Sarah to have the answers, but it felt good to say it aloud. To put the words out into the world and not carry them alone anymore. "That's awful," Sarah said, her voice filled with empathy. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that, sophomore. You deserve so much better." Sophie nodded, her eyes on the lake. "It was the hardest thing I've ever had to face. I didn't know who I was anymore. But I'm getting there. I'm learning how to be okay again." Sarah reached out and squeezed her hand. "I'm so proud of you. It takes so much strength to get through something like that, and you're doing it. You're finding yourself again." It was a simple statement, but Sophie felt it deep in her chest. She was finding herself. Slowly. But it was happening. The days passed, and Sophie's world began to expand. She reconnected with friends, made new ones, and even began exploring some of her old hobbies. She joined a book club, something she had always wanted to do but had never made time for. She started volunteering at a local animal shelter, something that filled her heart with joy. There was a sense of purpose she had been missing, a quiet satisfaction in knowing she was building a life for herself, without the shadow of the past looming over her. One evening, a few months after Sarah's visit, Sophie found herself standing in front of a mirror, taking in the reflection. The woman looking back at her was different. Stronger. More at peace. She wasn't the broken person she had once been. Her eyes had softened, the hardness that had taken root in them after the betrayal was gone. She had rebuilt, not just her life, but herself. Her phone buzzed as she was getting ready for bed. It was a message from Emma. "I know we haven't talked in months, and I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted to let you know that I'm here. If you ever want to talk or need anything, I'm here. Always." Sophie stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the screen. She had spent so many nights wondering if she would ever hear from Emma again, if she would ever find the strength to face her sister. But now, the decision didn't feel so urgent. It wasn't about forgiveness or closure anymore. It was about moving forward. About living her own life, regardless of the past. Sophie didn't reply immediately. She didn't need to. The message was a small gesture, an olive branch, but it didn't change what had happened. Sophie had forgiven Emma in her heart, but it wasn't something she had to say out loud. Emma had apologized. And that was enough. Sophie had learned to let go of the anger, but the trust would take time to rebuild, if it ever would. For now, Sophie was focused on herself. On the life she was carving out, piece by piece. The road had been long and painful, but she had learned something important along the way. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant finding strength in the scars, in the broken places, and realizing that she was still whole. As Sophie turned off the light and slid under the covers, she felt a quiet peace settle over her. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. She had the power to shape her own story, and that was enough. In the silence of her room, she closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "I'm okay. I'm enough." The months that followed were marked by growth and renewal for Sophie. The pain of the past, while never entirely gone, had become a shadow she could finally walk away from. She had built a life from the broken pieces, a life she could call her own, one that was defined by her choices, her independence, and her resilience. One crisp autumn afternoon, Sophie decided to visit a local cafe she had always passed by but never entered. It was one of those quaint little places with mismatched furniture and soft jazz playing in the background. The kind of spot where people came to escape the world, to lose themselves in a book or a warm cup of coffee. Sophie needed something new, something simple. She stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling as she walked in. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and baked pastries filled the air, and Sophie took a deep breath, letting the warmth envelop her. She approached the counter, where a young woman with short, dark hair smiled at her. "Hi. What can I get you today?" the woman asked cheerfully. Sophie paused, scanning the menu. "I'll have a cappuccino, please. And one of those croissants." The woman nodded, quickly preparing the order. Sophie took a seat by the window, watching the people outside as they walked by. She loved this kind of quiet solitude, the kind where you could just observe life happening around you without being a part of it. It gave her space to think, to breathe. As she sipped her cappuccino, Sophie noticed a man sitting at the table across from hers, engrossed in a notebook, his pen moving quickly across the pages. He looked up for a moment, catching her eye, and smiled politely. Sophie returned the smile, not thinking much of it. But something about his presence seemed different. She couldn't quite place it, but there was a calmness about him that drew her in. He glanced down at his notebook again, but then, after a beat, he spoke. "Excuse me," he said, his voice soft. "I don't mean to interrupt, but I've seen you here a few times now. You're Sophie, right?" Sophie blinked, caught off guard. Yeah. That's me. How did you?" "I'm Nathan," he replied, offering her a warm smile. "I've seen you in the park a few times. I go there for walks. You always seem so peaceful, even when I can tell you've got a lot on your mind." Sophie felt a strange flutter in her chest. She hadn't expected anyone to notice her, let alone approach her in such a direct way. But there was something about Nathan's presence that made her feel at ease. He wasn't like the men she had known before, there was no expectation, no pressure. He was simply there. "I'm not sure about the peaceful part," Sophie said with a half-laugh. "I've been through a lot lately." Nathan's eyes softened. "I can tell. But there's something about you that seems strong. Like you've been through something and come out the other side, better for it." Sophie wasn't sure how to respond to that. She didn't feel entirely better yet, but she appreciated the sentiment. "I guess I'm getting there," she said quietly. "It's been a process." Nathan nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I get that. I've been through my own stuff. Life's funny that way. It takes everything from you and leaves you with this blank canvas. The trick is learning how to fill it back in." Sophie felt a strange connection to him in that moment, a kind of recognition. Like he understood something she didn't even need to say aloud. She smiled softly, grateful for the unexpected kindness. "Well, it's nice to meet you, Nathan," she said, finishing her cappuccino. "I've got to head out soon, but it was good talking to you." Before she could stand, Nathan reached into his bag and pulled out a small card. "If you ever feel like chatting more, or just need someone to talk to, here's my number," he said, sliding the card across the table. Sophie hesitated for a moment, looking down at the card. She wasn't sure why, but she felt an inexplicable urge to keep it. She took it, tucking it into her pocket as she stood up. "Thanks," she said with a smile. "Maybe I'll take you up on that sometime." Nathan smiled back, his eyes warm. "Anytime." Sophie walked out of the cafe feeling lighter than she had in a long time. The encounter, though brief, had stirred something inside her. She didn't know where it would go, if anywhere, but for the first time in months, she allowed herself the possibility that something new might begin. As she continued her walk home, she thought about the message from Emma she had received months ago. Sophie had forgiven her in her heart, but she knew that some things could never go back to the way they were. She had found a new path, and though it was still uncertain, she had learned that it was okay to embrace the unknown. She was strong enough to walk it alone, but there was no harm in opening herself up to the possibility of new connections. The future, she realized, was wide open. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of what it might hold. She was ready for whatever came next. The weeks following her encounter with Nathan felt like a gentle shift in Sophie's life. The occasional messages from him, simple check-ins, little moments of connection, started to fill the gaps that had once felt so vast. He wasn't pushing for anything more, just offering a steady, calm presence, and Sophie found herself looking forward to their chats, even if they were brief. One evening, after another long day spent at the animal shelter, Sophie received a message from Nathan. "Hey, how's your day going?" It was the sort of message that felt light, easy. She didn't need to think too hard about it. Sophie found herself smiling as she typed back, *busy, as usual, but it's good. "How about you?" As she waited for his reply, Sophie leaned back against her couch, taking in the quiet of her apartment. It was hers now, no longer a place full of painful memories, but a space she had slowly made her own. She had painted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and added little touches, plants, framed art, candles. It was cozy, a haven she could retreat to after the chaotic world outside. She had worked hard to create this space, a reflection of her new beginning. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. Nathan's message had arrived, *same here. "Actually, I was thinking, would you like to grab coffee tomorrow? I know a place I think you'd really like." Sophie paused, her fingers hovering over the screen. She had gotten used to her own company, the solace in the quiet. But this didn't feel like a rush, a demand. It felt easy, inviting, even. She hadn't gone out with anyone in months, hadn't made space for anything new. Yet, something about Nathan felt different. He wasn't asking for anything, just offering a moment of shared company. "Sure, that sounds nice." She hit send, surprised at how natural it felt. The next afternoon, Sophie walked into the small cafe Nathan had suggested, a cozy spot tucked in a quiet part of the city. It was warm inside, the air filled with the scent of freshly ground coffee beans and soft laughter. As soon as she entered, Nathan stood up from a corner booth and waved her over, his smile easy and genuine. "Hey, I'm glad you came," Nathan said, motioning for her to sit down. "I was starting to think I'd have to drink this coffee alone." Sophie laughed and slid into the booth across from him. "I'm not that bad, am I?" she teased. Nathan chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Not at all. I just didn't know if I was imposing on your me time." Sophie smiled, surprised at how at ease she felt. There was no awkwardness, no pressure. Just two people sitting together, having a conversation. She was used to being cautious, keeping her guard up. But Nathan wasn't asking for anything more than this simple moment. They talked about everything, books they loved, their favorite spots in the city, the strange joy of spending an entire Saturday doing absolutely nothing. Nathan shared his thoughts on art, his personal projects, his work, while Sophie opened up about her newfound passion for volunteering. It felt refreshing. She hadn't realized how much she missed this kind of connection until now. After a while, their conversation shifted, and Sophie found herself looking at Nathan in a new light. There was something about him that felt grounded, genuine. He wasn't trying to fill any space in her life, just existing as part of it. She had spent so much of the last year healing, learning to trust herself again. And Nathan wasn't rushing her or offering any expectations. He was simply there. Eventually, their conversation slowed, and for a moment, the silence between them felt comfortable, rather than heavy. Sophie realized then that she was enjoying herself, not because she was forcing it, but because it was natural. For the first time in a while, she wasn't thinking about the past or the future. She was just, in the moment. Nathan broke the silence with a soft chuckle. "I'm glad we did this. I don't know why, but you're easy to talk to." Sophie smiled, her heart unexpectedly light. "I'm glad too," she said. It's nice to just sit and be with someone without feeling like I have to explain everything." Nathan nodded. "I get that. Sometimes, it's just about being with someone, not having to be anyone but yourself." They spent another hour talking about life, about the small moments, the quiet joys, and the fleeting struggles. And as the time passed, Sophie realized that Nathan wasn't just some random person she'd met. He had become part of her world, and she was grateful for it. He didn't ask her to fix herself, didn't pressure her to move past her pain. He was content to simply be with her, to share a connection without the need for anything more. When it was time to leave, they stood up together, walking toward the door. "Thanks for this," Sophie said, smiling up at him. "It's been a while since I've had such an easy conversation." Nathan grinned. "Anytime, Sophie. I'm happy to be the one you trust to talk to." As they stepped outside into the cool evening, Nathan turned to her with a small, sincere smile. "Maybe next time, we can check out a new bookshop I found. I think you'd love it." Sophie thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "Sounds perfect." The evening ended with a wave and a promise to meet again soon. Sophie walked home that night with a warmth in her chest she hadn't expected to find. She wasn't sure where things would go with Nathan, but she knew that for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of seeing what might happen next. She had spent so long healing from the wounds of the past, and while she had no illusions that everything was completely behind her, she was finally open to new experiences. Sophie had learned that moving forward didn't mean forgetting or erasing the past, it meant finding peace with it and making space for what was still to come. And with Nathan, perhaps, there was something new to discover. But for now, she was content to take things one step at a time. After everything, she had earned the right to just live. Sophie's life, once defined by the echo of betrayal and loss, was slowly becoming something new, something she could shape and mold as she saw fit. The months following her coffee date with Nathan had been full of small but significant moments, and each one reminded her how far she had come. She still had moments of doubt, of course, small flashes of fear that crept into her mind when she thought about opening herself up to someone new. But they were fleeting, and with each passing day, she grew stronger, more confident in her ability to navigate her own path. Her relationship with Nathan was something she had never expected, nor planned for. It wasn't dramatic or full of grand gestures. Instead, it was steady. Grounded. It was the kind of connection Sophie had always yearned for but never thought she deserved. No pressure, no expectations, just two people exploring life together in the most organic way possible. Nathan had become someone she could lean on, someone who accepted her for exactly who she was, flaws and all. They spent weekends exploring the city, finding new cafes, bookstores, and parks to visit. They shared lazy Sunday mornings reading together in silence, their only sound the rustle of pages turning. There were moments when Sophie could feel the weight of her past creeping in, moments when she wondered if she was truly ready to trust again. But Nathan never pushed. He simply showed up, day after day, letting her move at her own pace. One evening, after a particularly long day at the animal shelter, Sophie returned home to find a message from Nathan. It was simple, as usual, but it struck her deeply. "I was thinking about you today. Just wanted to say how grateful I am for the space you've made for me in your life. I know it's not always easy, but I see you. And I appreciate you more than words can say." Sophie sat down at her kitchen table, staring at the message for a moment before putting her phone down. She let out a long breath, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. She hadn't realized how much she had needed to hear that, but now that she had, it was like a missing piece falling into place. The doubts she had held onto about herself, about her worth, started to fade in the face of his kindness. Nathan had never demanded anything from her. He had simply been there, showing up when she needed it most. The next weekend, Sophie invited him over for dinner at her place, something she hadn't done in a long time. It wasn't a big deal, but it felt like a significant step for her. She had spent the evening cooking, nothing fancy, just pasta and a simple salad, and when Nathan arrived, he was exactly what she needed. Relaxed. Genuine. There was no tension, no awkwardness, just the feeling of two people enjoying each other's company in a way that felt completely natural. They ate, laughed, and shared stories about their lives, about their families, their pasts. Nathan talked about his childhood in a small town, and Sophie shared the quiet moments she had learned to cherish in her own life. As the evening wore on, Sophie found herself feeling completely at peace, a feeling she hadn't experienced in such a long time. When dinner was over, they sat on the couch, and Nathan turned to her with a thoughtful look on his face. "I know we've been taking things slow," he said, his voice gentle, "but I just want you to know that I'm here, Sophie. I'm not going anywhere." The words caught Sophie off guard, and for a brief moment, she felt that old fear stir. The fear of loss. The fear of opening up too much and getting hurt again. But when she looked into Nathan's eyes, she didn't see someone trying to take anything from her. She saw someone offering her the very thing she had always wanted: acceptance, patience, and a promise that things would unfold at her own pace. Sophie took a deep breath and smiled, her heart swelling with an unfamiliar warmth. She had spent so much time being afraid of what might happen next, of what could go wrong. But now, she realized something important: it wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about learning to live fully, even in the face of uncertainty. And that was something she had to do for herself, not for anyone else. "I'm here too, Nathan," she said, her voice steady. "And I'm grateful for you." The moment was simple, but it was everything. In that small, quiet exchange, Sophie understood that her healing wasn't just about letting go of the past, it was about embracing the present and being open to what the future could hold. She didn't have to carry the weight of her past with her anymore. She was learning to trust again, not just in others, but in herself. As Nathan left that night, Sophie stood at the door, watching him walk down the stairs with a smile that was genuine, peaceful. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, closing her eyes for a moment. It was strange, how far she had come from the woman who had once felt so broken. But here she was, whole again, learning, growing, and living a life that was truly hers. The phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting her thoughts. She pulled it out to see a message from Emma. It had been months since they last spoke, but the message felt different now. "I know we're not where we used to be, and I don't expect things to go back to the way they were. But I'm hoping we can find a way to move forward. I'm sorry, Sophie, for everything." Sophie stared at the message, her heart heavy but not broken. She had forgiven Emma long ago, but the distance between them had already been set. There were some things that couldn't go back to the way they were. Sophie had learned that. But as she typed her response, she realized that forgiveness wasn't about fixing everything. It was about letting go, setting herself free from the anger and hurt. She had done that. "I forgive you, Emma. And I hope you find peace. Sophie set the phone down, taking a final look around her apartment. The past had shaped her, but it didn't define her. She was stronger, wiser, and more at peace than she had ever been. Her life was her own now, full of possibility, full of promise. And for the first time in a long time, Sophie knew that whatever came next, she was ready. She was more than enough. The future, at last, was hers to shape.